So thank you all for coming back after an hour break. It's impressive, but we have a very impressive panel here. I think Felicia took my Oprah joke this morning, so I was thinking, well, who am I going to be now? And so since it's an election year, I thought, well, I could be Megyn Kelly, I could be Rachel Maddow, or I could be Erin Burnett. So you all take your pick, depending on which TV channel you watch. So welcome to our panel discussion on innovations in research and understanding. I'm Missy Nachbar. Some of you may think I look really familiar, but you don't know what that name is. So Koppelman, if that rings a bell for some of you, it recently changed. And I'm really honored to facilitate our distinguished panel today. So we're going to cover 7 themes, if you will: innovation, social science research, training, methodology and data collection, big data, of course, as we've talked about a lot today, dissemination, information design, and impact, all in one segment, and privacy. And then we're going to have a discussion, and we will leave time at the end for audience participation, so jot down any questions that you have. So I'm very proud to say that I've been at NORC for 27% of its history. You can figure out how long that is. And like Felicia, I'd say, well, I'd like to be here another 27%, but hopefully I will be an active retiree and they can study me on the NSHAP study at that time. So I thought it was important. I know that the bios are in your handouts, but I thought it was just important to just do some brief introductions. But I think part of what's going to be interesting about this discussion is we have such a wide array of panelists from different markets, different segments and stuff. And so I thought it'd be interesting to just first hear just a brief introduction. So Stuart, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So this is an unbelievably wonderful occasion to be here. I feel I am a child of these two institutions. I was raised at NORC and the University of Chicago in a period which Norman was sort of giving some memory of, in the sense where, and I come out of the sociology department. I came to my name. I'm sorry. My name is Stuart Michaels. I'm now a senior research scientist in the academic research centers, and I work on sexuality. And the reason I work and able to and do work on sexuality is I was able to come as a graduate student to NORC in 1988. When we got a contract to design a national sexual behavior study, which I've always referred to as the Kinsey study for the age of AIDS. 40 or 50 years of no representative data on sexual practices in the US, finally, at the end of the Reagan administration, was recognized as something that had to be done. So if there was anything that I did in those periods, and I got to learn survey research by building a project with Bob Michael, Ed Lauman, and John Gagnon, who recently passed away, who was the sex guy from sociology, who was at Stony Brook. We got to build a project that had never been really tried or done by using the expertise of master survey research people. Bob was the director of NORC. Ed was chair or dean of the sociology department, running parts of the university, and they had done a lot of work to develop the proposal. In any case, we got after, and I think one of the things that I'm actually struck by in this, because we've talked a little bit about social context, is that how different the worlds were then. We were actually politically stopped for 5, 6, 7 years because the right wing didn't want such a survey. And if I made one contribution along with Michael Reynolds to that survey, was when everyone was concerned about same-sex behavior, and we said people were ready to ask the behavior questions, but we said we also have to ask about sexual identity. And that was one of the things that stopped us politically. And that was between 1988 and 1992. The irony is today, I work on projects for CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, to to figure out the wording of those questions. So the sexual identity question, which we included for the first time, is now the question that has been developed for the National Health and Interview Survey and is being pushed out on all major national surveys. So there's content, there's lots of methodological things we can talk about because we're also doing studies now of young gay men, young men who have sex with men in the south side of Chicago, where we're using many other methods and integrating sort of the knowledge that we gained from back then.
Great.
Little
Thank
introduction.
You, Stuart. Thank you.
That's great.
Teri?
Hi, I'm Teri Schindler, and I'm representing Fathom Information Design. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. And we're partnering with NORC on the information design side of things, so the packaging and the way you think about the presentation of the data. I've been there. We started in 2010. This is our 7th year. We primarily work in 3 different areas. The first is external communications, how things might be consumed outside an organization. We look at communications to internal audiences, where dashboards tend to break down at the Tableau level and create sort of different tools for different organizations to use. And then at the education level, we're currently teaching a course at MIT at the Media Lab on information design for the age of big data, or however you want to talk about that. So our clients of the past 7 years have sort of spanned from DARPA to the World Bank to Volkswagen and Nike. So have an interesting perspective vis-a-vis what NORC is doing.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
So my name's Curtis Cobb, and I actually manage the population and survey sciences team at Facebook. When we talk about things like big data, Facebook has it in spades. But nonetheless, they still want a team to actually do more traditional demography and more traditional survey research, and I am the one who manages that. I almost feel like I have part of my intellectual heritage coming from NORC and University of Chicago as well. While I didn't attend school here, one of my advisors was Ed Lauman's student, and Becky Sandifer, and then I was also Norman Nye's last grad student when he was at Stanford. And then I worked for Mike Dennis in my first job outside of grad school. And so I grew up on all the stories of everything great about NORC and the University of Chicago and the heritage that it has. So it's really an honor to be here.
We're always hiring.
So are we.
Touche. Jenny.
I'll talk to you afterwards about the positions we have.
One for you.
My name's Jenny Benz. I'm the Deputy Director of the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research. I am a political scientist who did not end up at Michigan. And I have worked at NORC since 2003. It has been the only career I have had, although during my time at NORC, I have held a number of different types of jobs and positions and in different departments. So I've had opportunities to see the organization grow over the past few years from different perspectives.
Good afternoon. Brian Harris-Kojetin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Committee on National Statistics at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. I guess that didn't sound data scientist-y enough. So somebody put it in as the National Academies of Math and Engineering. But anyway, I have only been there for the past year. I did spend 14 years at the Statistical and Science Policy Office at the Office of Management and Budget, where my main connection to NORC, I think, was reviewing all of their surveys that they were doing for federal statistical agencies. And it could be that I was invited because they thought I was still there, and it might be good to put me up on a podium. But
We know
anyway,
you're
they did
not
retract
because we
me.
can't call you anymore when something's stuck in clearance. We know.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. So, and I'm Missy Nachbar, and I head up NORC's Business Ventures and Innovation group at NORC, and so we're really excited here to talk about that. So in order to understand the future, I think it's always important to talk about our past, and we've talked about a lot of that history, and just to talk a little bit about Dan and Norman's talk here this morning. I think they focused a lot about NORC, and we have a lot of the same questions and cover a lot of the same topics. So what I'm excited about for this panel is that we have this wide array of panelists and hearing different views and different opinions and different thoughts about that. So it's often said that the more things change, the more things stay the same. Given our long history in social science research, for NORC 75 years and the university 125, what's one aspect of your work that hasn't changed or you really don't foresee changing in the future? Who would like to start?
Well, if you don't mind. Being at Facebook, there is constant change and there's constant innovation. And we see new tools being developed. We see new methods, new statistical models emerging to deal with the amount of data that we have and the questions that we want to ask. But the thing that I think never changes, and one of the reasons why I think they found value in having people with social science backgrounds and more traditional research backgrounds at Facebook, is that the ability to plan and design good research doesn't change. Knowing how to construct a study and knowing how to think about what you need in order to answer the questions that you should answer and what those questions should be instead of just anything is something that I think has not changed, at least in the time that I've been doing social science research. And I don't think it's really changed from the time that my advisors were around. The tools have changed. The process, the sociological imagination of being able to abstract these things in order to do good research, ask the right questions, hasn't changed.
Jenny?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the natural extension of that is that our mission and our impact hasn't changed. That, again, no matter what the questions are we're asking, the tools we're using to address them, the goals are still the same, to give a voice to people, whether it's through big data or surveys, make sure their voice is part of the process, and make sure that our research is affecting policy and affecting the communities who need some help.
So this was the one question that I actually did some homework for. I went through some Academies reports and found a really nice statement of I think of the current situation. Talks about a survey done of majority of survey organizations reported increasing difficulties in conducting surveys in recent years. Response rates have declined or have been maintained only by increased effort and higher unit costs. And some of these declines in response rates may be accompanied by declines in the accuracy of reporting as well. A number of reasons were cited for the reported increasing difficulties in securing response. Among them were changing lifestyles that make access to designated respondents increasingly difficult, proliferation of survey-like activities, skepticism about the purpose, validity, or usefulness of surveys, inadequacy of survey techniques, etc. So you're probably wondering, was this, the report we issued just a couple of years ago on non-response, or 2009? 2000 or 1989. Actually, it started with the NLSY in 1979. It's a 1979 report on privacy and confidentiality as factors in survey response. So I think you'd have a hard time saying that it's not relevant today, or that some of those aren't the same questions we're all trying to figure out how to deal with. So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so the one, I would echo some of the things, or I would have echoed some of the things that Curtis was saying, but the other thing I was thinking about was, for me, what's been interesting is that the discipline of survey research has served as a paradigm and model for me throughout. And it isn't about the method, but it's the issues, and we think about them in lots of different ways. But the problems of representativeness and generalizability apply across not only that method, but also to qualitative methods. They're the general problems of the validity and the usefulness of social science data. So there's that part, the measurement problems, which have been, sort of the bread and butter, but they also don't change. What I've noticed, when we did the original study, we did paper and pencil and self-administered forms that people put in a sealed envelope and gave back to the interviewer. We have very different techniques for doing those same things, but the problem has very much remained the same. So it's really those sorts of, and I think there are others. I guess the other one that I would also say that feels like a constant is the trade-offs that you have to make. That there are always competing, and basically there's budget constraints. And we know things about methods, but it's really having to make the crucial best decisions at the time to get the best data means that you have to allow one thing that you would like to do not to be done and to figure out what the priorities are. So those things seem to me to remain constant, and we're just always trying to solve them with new techniques.
Great. Okay, so now let's change gears. Instead of talking about our past, let's talk about our future, and let's talk about innovation. So I love this question. I'll tell you why. So what is the biggest innovation in your field or area of expertise in the past few decades? And Curtis and I laughed. Some people on the panel have not worked for decades. So I said, in the last 5, 6, 7 years for those of you that have not worked decades like some of the rest of us. So Teri, you want to start us off?
Sure. I think what we're seeing is just the way people are becoming accustomed to swimming in a sea of data. So the way the ultimate consumer of that information, whether they be a subject matter expert or just the general public, they're sort of inundated with all this stuff. There's a certain amount of commoditization that's going on when it comes to data products. And so how you tell stories with that, how you consider your audience and your context of use as well as the data, how you create a platform that lets people have different ways to come in and explore it or the way they metabolize that information. So it's really about the communication techniques that we're using in addition to the back end technology that we can do and we can play with to display data differently or give people different hooks in.
I think that one area over the past couple of years that's been really interesting to see is the design of new data collection and data products with the foresight of what we can do with big data out there. And so, looking in-house at NORC with Amerispeak, we've designed a product where we have address-based sampling and we know where every respondent is, and our ability to be able to geocode them and link them to big data and answer questions that have long perplexed social science. I have attitude data and self-report data about what a respondent, turns on and off their lights, their energy use, what they think about energy policy, but the ability to be able to, match that to their actual utility records and see, is there really a correlation between attitudes and behavior? Big questions that we've struggled with, and now we can look ahead and know what big data are capable of helping to complement the survey data and design our structures and data collection products to meet that need.
Just to build on that a little bit, so I found it very interesting in the last decade or so, the reinvigoration of mail surveys, the obsolete technology, that was left way behind, all of a sudden is very attractive now that we have good frames and the advantage of great geocoding compared to the crappy geocoding we had on our UV surveys. And how those have come back in much more in mainstream use. Now we're using them to also push people to the web and do other things through mail, but kind of the old coming back as well.
Yeah, and I think it's not always, too, about these sort of giant leaps forward. Sometimes they're really small things. So we finished a year ago, in March, a big project with the Gates and Clinton Foundations on the progress of women over the last 20 years. And in one of the subsequent conversations that people were having, there was an event, and someone said, well, what's the biggest headline to come out of all this data? And it was about 1 million data points over globally, from everything from health and education to leadership and things like that. And what Ben ended up saying on this, and I thought this was interesting, he said, look, that some of the headlines aren't that surprising. Women in third world countries still suffer from poor health care, and women in first world countries still suffer underrepresentation in positions of power. But what's really fascinating is it's 2015, and this is the first time this data that represents 52% of the population is in one place. That was actually the step forward. It wasn't what, fancy graphics and gee whiz anything. It was that it was all in one place and you could actually look at it together in context.
So interestingly for me, I've still mostly been in the design data world. So it's data collection that is really the biggest challenge, and often in very limited, smaller scale. And one of the themes in the work that I've done has been social networks. So, partly this is to talk about that I agree that they're big changes, but they're also incremental. That they are related, they're related to the problems we were trying to address before. So the biggest innovation in the recent projects that I've been able to do is actually the use of Facebook. As a supplement. And I think actually we were at a conference, that's where I met Curtis the first time, that was organized by a former University of Chicago sociology and NORC, had worked at NORC graduate student. It was fascinating. And people were running all over the place trying to figure out how to use social media in various ways and to address all different kinds of methodological and substantive questions. But one of the things that was interesting when we talked was ours was the only project that actually had combined, as far as I could tell, had combined a very traditional approach, well, not traditional exactly, but the latest version of trying to get a probability sample from a hard-to-reach population. So we'd used a network-based respondent-driven sample, but we'd still had very much the model of a sample. And we did all the interviewing that we do on all our surveys about their confidants and sex partners. So we had network data collected through direct interview techniques. But we were also able, and surprisingly how willing our young respondents were willing to share their list of Facebook friends. So what this has provided is a really interesting thing because you get to combine both directly asked questions and then very powerful data that allows you to really look at networks, but to understand what those networks are, to see what's behind. I mean, the fact that somebody has 4,000 Facebook friends and that's all you know raises whole new questions. So I would say that that's sort of where I see the innovation, that we're still trying to deal with a lot of the older problems. There are new methods and techniques, and it does raise some new questions, but also allows us to speak to some very traditional questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. Both what you were saying and what you were saying is that before we would try to answer a bunch of questions using the best data we had available. And for example, we know asking behavioral questions on surveys, whether we're trying to use a diary study or just asking people to recall what they did or anything else, we know those things are flawed. But they were the best that we had at the time. And now it's just becoming so much easier to merge records, either administrative records or if you think about online behavior or something else, even where people can volunteer, such as giving essentially their social networks to the extent that their online networks represent their offline networks, which we at Facebook have a strong opinion that it does. And we have some research to back that up. But, just being able to do those things and take away some of that measurement error and be able to use the space on surveys, for example, for things that we can't get from behavioral log data or something else, where we're trying to get at attitudes and things like that, has really been it's been every social scientist's dream, right? We always wanted to combine the attitudinal with the behavioral with the knowledge, and this is really allowing us to do it, even if we're not doing it at the same time period. So, for example, we could get survey questions and track people's behaviors going forward and knowing what they're doing in ways that were much more expensive before.
What do you think we'll come back to the social media, but before we get there, talk a little bit about what do you think has been the most kind of impactful technological advancement? Again, I think someone spoke earlier, or I think it was Rupa who spoke earlier, talking about kind of, well, we didn't necessarily invent this stuff, but we've used things from other places. So what do you think in the work that you do, what the biggest technological impact has been?
Online surveys. And I don't think it's just with the work that I do at Facebook or the fact that I was at Knowledge Networks before I was at Facebook. But I think that there is much less appetite to do research work that takes a long time to answer a question that somebody has right away. And I think that online surveys were an excellent technological step forward to allow us to give people much faster answers to the questions they were interested in at the time that they were interested in them. And without being able to do that, I think that research would be stuck in a niche of projects that are either very, very long-term, like what happens with the federal government, or just nice to have information, rather than impacting things that change very quickly like we're able to now.
I'm looking at Brian. That was just a nice lead-in. But
I'll save that.
What else? Who else wants to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think there are some very important questions about, which I think of that as sort of mode, of different modes of data collection. But I think the other piece, and for me, these are sort of somewhat unsolved problems, but I have lived long enough. And I mean, I really did start in the early days, at least as an undergraduate, watching, data that was put onto punch cards and running analyses with the first version of SPSS when you could do these little tiny things. So those capabilities, I think, are huge. And they're both very exciting, but I think there's also a lot of challenges to be able, to manage and wrangle the different amounts and sizes of data. I think we're struggling with that in our study, but it is a huge step forward. So, and I think it's raising new problems and presenting tremendous opportunities. So this thing of having this, just managing this network data is from both sides, but then also having the possibility of putting them together. I'm really excited about what we might be able to do, but I'm still also struggling with it.
I'm going to take a very different attack at this question, only because of what I do. For me, I think it's really interesting the collapse between the Chinese wall between the B2B audience and the B2C audience. That increasingly people are looking for dashboards for their lives. Once you understand, I don't understand why Nike doesn't know who I am when I go from my fuel band to the store or to whatever else I'm doing. They're desperately trying to figure that out and get that answer. But at the same time, I do think still industry, and I think in industries that you all serve and partner with, are still seeing it siloed. And I don't think the actual consumer is seeing it siloed. Once they, sort of that idea of the next best, the best user experience you just had now becomes the entry point, the standard. You want to see it everywhere. And so that has an impact on what you're doing and how you're bundling it. It's no longer just, well, this is for that, this is for that group. I think we're all accustomed to seeing data. We're accustomed to using data. And so I think the bigger challenge is to say, how can we think about the audience in context of use here, but more generally, what are we talking about? How are we going to present this?
I think online and mobile for taking methods that we used to couple with survey data and updating them, just like web surveys updated surveys. So we've long combined, doing a survey with doing focus groups or in-depth interviews, and now we can, do it within a single respondent all in one fell swoop. So we can administer questions and, you told me that you're frightened to walk within a mile of your home at night. take some pictures on your smartphone and upload them, and then, do your smartphone camera and, tell me a story, tell me what it is that made you scared to walk within your home in a mile, And so you can get that qualitative data and the survey data together in real time, and I think that only amplifies how we can use multi-method studies moving forward.
Okay, let's come back to social media and for a minute. It impacts a lot of you and a lot of your work. And think about kind of what's different now. What can you do? What can't you do? How has it helped? How has it hurt? If you will, kind of the traditional survey world. We've talked a little bit about, I think, some ways where it's been really helpful. Have there been other kind of thinking that it's not, or why it might not be? Our audience, we've talked a lot about consumers.
This is still a big mystery to me, and so I'm hoping to learn more here. But I think the other thing that's interesting to me, which is that it's also changing the social world that we're studying. So, that's for the research that we're trying to do. First on these young black men who have sex with men, but also now on adolescents in some sort of national online survey. Their worlds are very different because of how much of the time is spent interacting with the internet. The information, we're interested in where they get information and knowledge, how they meet partners, and so on and so forth. And so, for me, I don't think I've gotten there yet, because I'm always on this thing that there's a lot of continuity, but there's also a lot of change. I'm not positive. I think sometimes people, I also hear a lot of talk. So, about what these changes have meant, and I'm very skeptical that we really know yet. So I think it's a great area for research. I think we need to know a lot more about and it's a little bit, this may come back to a discussion that Curtis and I have to have. I can imagine that there's a lot of overlap between the personal networks and the social media networks, but there are also differentiations within that. I don't believe that people have 4,000 close personal friends. No. So, but within, but I also want to, so that's where there's wonderful work to do, right? And very wonderful research about understanding how we could understand how those things, because they're more complex networks that have.
Yeah, and to be honest, the information that we have about people's networks internally at Facebook is not simply just the number of friends that they have, but we know all the ties between them and their friends, how many mutual ties they have. We know how often they're actually communicating with each other on Facebook. We know how often they're showing up in pictures together. We know so much information that we actually develop an internal coefficient.
Are you all scared right now?
To
change privacy settings.
That's our last part, privacy.
And we allow you to control your privacy settings in ways that should make you feel comfortable. Sharing all this information with us. I agree with you entirely. Nobody has 4,000 close friends. Right. And if you think about Dunbar's number or something like that, it's, maybe around 100. I forget exactly what Dunbar's number is. But to get at the question of social media, how does it help? How does it hurt? I think it's socially. I think the question is still out there. I think it's a transition, and we'll always have people who can come up with ways that it hurts. There's things like FOMO, fear of missing out, that becomes a popular research topic for a while, and well-being and all those sorts of things. And some studies say it helps, some studies say it hurts. With respect to the survey research industry, or the research industry in general, I'm really happy that Facebook feels the need to have people who can do traditional research, not just because it means I have a job, although that's important too. I like to live. And San Francisco is very expensive. But I think there's this cottage industry that has sprung up that tries to be social media consultants in understanding the data that exists out there. They like to do what they call sentiment analysis and things like that, where they take the text data that is being produced on these social media sites, whether sometimes they are able to use Facebook, although we're pretty restrictive about what external sites can actually get from our data. More common, they'll use something like Twitter. And they'll analyze what's being said about a company or some person or something like that. It's great to understand the types of phrases and words and ways that people are talking about things, but that does not replace a representative survey that actually will tell you what the population that you're trying to understand thinks. When you think about that sort of sentiment analysis and things like that, all it is a bunch of people standing in a park with a megaphone. It is not everyone's opinion. There's a lot of people that won't share the opinions that are expressed. It's the loudest voice. But it doesn't get sold as the loudest voice. It gets sold as this is what people are thinking. And I think we have to be very, very careful about that. And we have to find ways to distinguish what we do as survey researchers or researchers that apply a bit more rigor versus what these other places are doing. Because they're fast, they're cheap, and for some situations, the data you get from them is fine. But the problem is the people that are consuming that data, the consumers or the businesses that are consuming it, they don't distinguish between that data and what we do. They don't understand the quality differences. And it is our responsibility, if we want to keep having a career, in order to demonstrate the value that we have beyond that.
Well, and that's an interesting example because this is actually one of the cases, one of the few cases in the entire world that's where there is a statistical agency, Statistics Netherlands, is actually, you've probably seen these figures, where the government actually does put out an index of consumer sentiment, which is not done by government agencies, it's done by University of Michigan Conference Board here. But Statistics Netherlands produces that data series, and they did the sentiment analysis of Twitter and Facebook and some other social media sites. And there's a very nice tracking. Again, you can say, well, this is another case of Google flu. It works really well in one time period, and who knows whether this is really going. But this is one of the few cases where actually there are big data being used to produce a national statistical series or being mapped with one.
I would love, Lee and I talked a lot about quality as an entry point. I do think this is a really great point to bring up, which is,
You know, how will organizations like the University of Chicago, like NORC, Facebook, have the conversation, be in dialogue? So we said there's tons of data out there and people are getting used to dealing with it, but they're not particularly data literate. Yeah. In many cases. And so you're right, you know, it gets sold, people take it at face value. And so I do think there is a certain opportunity, some might say an imperative, to sort of say, what is our role in the data literacy? Because just saying we're from this institution is probably not going to be enough when you really put it out there. I mean, maybe with certain partners, but at large, in writ large in the community, it's probably not going to be enough, because people assume if there's certain, like if they say, oh, it's data, it's kind of like someone comes in a white coat to you in a hospital and you're like, oh, you're probably pretty good. You're a doctor, right? You're not thinking about this. And so if it comes out and it's dressed up as data, people take it at face value in many cases.
You got it from a data scientist, then.
That's right.
I mean, I think not only are people not data literate, but they don't read peer-reviewed journals on a regular basis. Shocker. And so, I mean, social media is also a huge tool that social scientists can leverage to get our findings out there. And again, mission and impact, and that's what we want to do. And so, you know, meeting people where they are. Huge proportions of this country get the majority of their information from social media. Mm-hmm. So why aren't we meeting them there, giving them the information they need, not just saying, oh, here's our latest study, but, you know, figuring out what the trending hashtag is and engaging in these conversations, having was going to say Twitter chats. Is there a Facebook equivalent? I don't even know.
It's okay. You're allowed.
It's all right. It's all right. Twitter
We
exists
can
for
mention
now.
that G word too.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's still something we're starting to embark on and leverage and use, but there's definitely a whole lot more potential there.
Let's continue on that thread. I was going to say, because one of the questions we had talked about as we were thinking about that panel is kind of what is our role as social scientists in educating the consumer? So what are ways that we can do it? I mean, Jenny, you started alluding to some of it, but
What we're seeing clients do is they're, so huge distribution channel, obviously, like Jenny said, and really using it to go out there and disseminate work. We had a funny example where we did something with Reuters on China, power in China, where we actually mapped relationships of 3,000 very powerful people in China. And when we released it, we sort of watched it on Google Analytics, and we watched it go from where it was introduced down in the South at a conference, sort of made its way to Washington within an hour. It was on the West Coast in an hour and a half. It was in Europe in 3 hours. At this point, we were kind of drunk. And then, it was a long project. And then in 8 hours, it was in China, and in 10 hours, it was banned. So that's sort of how that goes. But we are seeing people really use this as distribution channels. What they're wrestling with, and so somebody who came, so based on that project, someone who came to us and they said, here's what we want from you. And we're like, okay, the creative brief. And they said, we want what you did for Nike, which was purely a Twitter campaign, like that's all it was, using fuel band data, and what you did for China, which was for subject matter experts on policy. And we're like, okay. Okay. And what they really meant was it needs to be socially shareable. It needs to be able to do this, but it needs to pass all the quality tests, right? Like if I'm a scientist, I need to be able to go in and feel confident in the information that's here. And so, sort of we deconstructed that that's what they were actually saying. World Bank looked at it a different way. They released a beta of their India program. And they wanted to just take something, initially their problem was, we're going to take this report that's this big, this 5-year report, and we want to make it an open app. So people will be more engaged with it, people will see it, it can be more up to date. But their 2.0 was we want all social functionality in it. We want people to be able to come back to us. We want people on the ground in India saying, guess what, you're reporting that this project is 75% done, and I live right here, and it's not 75% done. So that's how, so people are really wrestling with this.
Yeah,
Wrestling.
Yeah, wrestling. Yeah, I think it's the value add as well. Mm-hmm. I can't help but think about C. Wright Mills, which may not be an appropriate reference for this conference, given his thing about abstract empiricism, I mean. Some might call it imperialism, too. That might have been a little bit of a Freudian slip. But abstract empiricism, and I think that's what we see emerging, even to a greater extent than what he was talking about when he was thinking more about Lazarsfeld and survey research in general. And I think the value add that we bring is that we actually understand the quality trade-offs. And we need to be able to express those to people, show that they matter, but we also need to be flexible to the extent that not everything has to be airtight and completely rigorous, that we have to be comfortable making trade-offs. The other thing is we have to bring, and the point for bringing up C. Wright Mills, we have to bring the sociological imagination. That there has to be sort of a connection of why these empirical findings matter and what they mean for the social world. That I think that those of us who are not coming out of the at data analysis as so many people are now, as where they just think it's cool to crunch numbers. But where we actually think about what are the questions we're trying to answer with them first, and then developing the data for that. And I think that's where we provide value, and that's where we have to continue to push.
So I think this is something we struggle with, the federal statistical agencies struggle with, and I think some of us trying to help them and innovate struggle with as well, in terms of define products, it's like, well, we've always done it this way. It has to be this level of quality instead of really a fitness for use criteria and understanding better, what is useful for different things. That it doesn't have to always, sometimes, waiting 6 months to get something that's really, really accurate isn't as good as getting something that's pretty darn close next week. But we have not been good ourselves in terms of really articulating those trade-offs or how to describe things without simply saying, well, the response rate for this survey was 80% and the response rate for yours was 10%, so clearly, we have better data than you do. Yeah, and they weren't that different. And sometimes they are. But grappling with how we can, as a field, better communicate more the nuances of quality and usefulness. And because not everything, customer satisfaction surveys don't need 95% response rates to be useful.
Right.
I think that's really important as NORC looks to diversify the types of clients that we're working with. And, with the AP NORC Center, we tend to work with foundations, and as we diversify into the commercial market, it's really a different process than a government RFP, and it is more collaborative in that design phase. And you really do start with the very first question, what do you want to know, why, and tell me the gravity of the types of decisions that you're going to use this data for. And then let's have a back and forth. And part of that back and forth is us educating them, we can do it for this amount of money with these disadvantages, this amount of money with these disadvantages, and these risks for your decision making, and then finding that middle ground. So it's our funders too, not just the public.
And I think this is what we have to teach students, because I will say that this sinks most of the people that I interview, because we go through conversations just like that. And they can do extremely rigorous work. They cannot talk about trade-offs for doing something less rigorous in a more timely manner. And that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah. Grad school trains people to critique the heck out of journal articles.
Right.
Yeah.
So funny, the next card is training. Thank you, Curtis, for that lovely setup.
He answered all of
one of the questions, right, that we had talked about is what are different, what is the different training that we need to give our graduate students, those early in their careers, maybe today, that we didn't need to do when those of us were in school, whenever that might have been. Some of us a little bit longer.
So I'm not with you guys, but I can tell you that we actually we don't try to hire really experienced developers, because they have a way that they come at these problems and a way that these things are represented. And we're actually trying to blow that up and trying to really get the design much closer to the very beginning. You talk about designing your surveys, and we're trying to get designing the end product to the very start. And that's incredibly frustrating for people who have 10 years plus of development experience of this is how you build it. And I'm sure you guys face that as well. Yeah. So it's really trying to get people to think more nimbly and across. For us, I assume it's probably the same for you guys.
I think as our speed dating panel showed earlier, between the university and NORC, there's just a huge amount of subject matter depth. We have specialists across all different fields, and that's obviously incredibly valuable. But one thing NORC, I think, has also always done is maintained a stable of generalists and people who have enough training in a bunch of different fields that they have a multidisciplinary perspective. They can understand theoretical foundations in different fields, they can speak the different languages, and they really serve as the bridge between different types of specialists. And I think that those people and training people, it was like a swear word in graduate school to say, I want to be a generalist. You didn't say that in a PhD program. It was something you hid very much, But I think it's incredibly important. And those people on every project are so important to making sure that everybody's communicating and getting the work done.
I think there are both hard skills that all students coming out of grad school should try to learn, particularly if they want to do empirical social sciences, possibly outside of a university. databases. Being able to pull data from using SQL or something like that, it's not difficult, but it's just a skill you have to have. Being able to do some low level of programming, maybe in Python is enough, but it's a skill that if you're in school now, there's no excuse for you not to be able to do some of that. But I'm actually more concerned about the softer skills, because I think that I can hire somebody and teach them what I call the hard skills. Mm-hmm. The softer skills that I think are lacking in a lot of the grad students that I interview now is I feel like they don't actually know how to plan and execute studies. That they've worked on parts of studies, but I can't set them free to go out and do one study all on their own. And I find that actually quite disturbing, because I think that's what grad school is actually supposed to train us to do. But I think if I remember my grad school experience, in the department I was in, we were encouraged to use an existing data set because it meant we didn't have to go out and find funding to collect data. So what does that mean? If people are taught to do that, they don't know how to actually go out into the field and collect data. The thinking was also do something that you are pretty sure will work so that you don't waste years doing and end up with nothing, right? And so what does that mean is that we took very safe approaches, answering very safe questions, and don't have the creativity that planning a study afresh and anew to answer a tough question actually requires. But I think that absolutely needs to be part of a student's training. The other thing that I'd say, besides what I'm going to call the research intuition portion, that's a soft skill, is being able to connect the interesting findings that you get with why they are important for somebody to care. We get researchers at Facebook who have very strong academic backgrounds, who do very, very interesting research, either before they were with us or when they were with us. They do not succeed at Facebook because they cannot make anyone care about that interesting finding that they have on well-being. Why should Facebook ever care about somebody's well-being? It does. It does. Let me say but it is a business, and it does because it knows that it's important for its business. And being able to connect that interesting finding to decision makers is also a soft skill that needs to be pushed.
I think that's across the board, though, in every industry.
True. Yeah. I guess one thing, a lot of good points have come up, here that's touching on various aspects. One of the last things Curtis was saying was reminding me of some of my cohort in grad school going through getting straight A's in all the statistics courses, and then as soon as they were actually had their own data, they sat there and said, I have no idea what to do with this. I knew how to just answer problems and do things. It's like, but actually being able, when it becomes real, and having that practical experience, it's like, okay, I know what these data are. Now really having to think about what you do with them, and some of this real application of skills, not just simply learning abstract math and how to program something, but really think about it.
And my sense is, we've had successful people come out of NORC and be at Facebook, is that they learned some of those working on actual projects that you guys were doing. And I think that's just key.
Yeah, it does feel like it would be difficult to plan this curriculum, but I think so there's probably not a perfect training grounds, because you need people who have different, who have different strengths. But I certainly would agree. I think there's something about, and I was very lucky to have that experience. That to be able to work on a project literally from its conception to its completion. But it took what was very true in that period was that people did work on projects, and it's actually something that's much less true for the current crops of graduate students. I think at this university and probably at others, where they're actually, and sometimes you're working on very small stuff. I mean, that's one of the great things about working at NORC is that people actually we need people, and we need parts of people so that people do get the chance to see the sort of the elephant from several different angles, which starts to help fill in some of these issues. But making these decisions and getting people up to the ability to be able to make the choices and know what's important and to understand. And then, the explanation and dissemination part, that's huge. I'm not sure. I think that's something we do. We're able sometimes, and when we do it well, we produce it over time.
And what you're both talking about, everybody's pretty much, is storytelling.
Yeah, yes.
How are we going to make this relevant to the audience, whoever that audience is, whether it's your business partner or your ultimate end consumer? We often say that data visualization and information design is a lot more like writing a novel than it is like computer science. It's really trying to say what's happening here and how are we going to talk about the story and elevate the story and make people care.
Well, and that relates to the sociological imagination part to me.
I agree.
I think that there is some way that the crucial test is kind of what your new insight and understanding is, which is really a story. It is a kind of a narrative. It's a conclusion to a problem. And having a better sense and strength, commitment to that, and understanding of its centrality does help a lot.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who still think about this as the last mile, right? It's like, well, we did all this, and now we just have to curl it over and disseminate it.
Yeah.
And what we're saying is that starts at the first mile. That starts when you're thinking about the study, and you move it all the way through. So our point of view is that it's not an artificial divide there. It starts early.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true for us with the AP NORC Center. I mean, anytime we tackle a policy problem, from the second we're trying to figure out what the research questions are and what items are going to be on the survey, we're thinking about, its news value. We're thinking about asking questions in a way that we're sure practitioners and policymakers can use them, and in a way that the study and the data, which all eventually go public, can still contribute to academics as well. And it's not impossible to serve all of those communities in the design and then at the end in the dissemination. I mean, you can, we run all these, multiple regressions, and, we do all the big statistics that we would do if we were putting out a peer-reviewed publication. And we know that rigor is there, but we can still write about it in a way that anybody can understand it in their newspaper in the morning. And we can, write it a little bit differently so that it's appropriate for policymakers. And so, making sure that you're asking the important questions and then leveraging this amazing data that you have so that it can make the most impact in as many audiences as possible.
And where that hits in representation and design is that your ultimate design doesn't reflect your database. It reflects the user. How am I going to get to that? Not, this is how we have it organized. And that's a real problem still. That is really a real problem out there.
So we've talked a bit about kind of collaboration and this notion of, various disciplines, and it takes a village, right? And there's the computer scientists and data scientists and statisticians and social science and subject matter experts that we've talked about. Kind of how have you, in your roles, that many of you have talked about this, how have you encouraged that collaboration, and what have you done so, you're kind of not siloed in your different disciplines?
Well, one of the cool things about being at the National Academy of Sciences is that that's actually the foundation for what we do, is putting together interdisciplinary teams and bringing people with different perspectives. So when we're trying to help a federal agency with a survey, well, we want people who are familiar with it, we want some people who are users, and then we want other people who are experts in other aspects of this who have never heard of this survey before, people who can bring a fresh perspective. And so you want all of these different disciplines coming together, as well as different experience with that kind of information. And we get all of our people, our volunteers, they do this and find find it so interesting and stimulating. They learn from and really find it, engage very actively with this. And I think, that gets reflected on, I certainly heard that reflected this afternoon with the study teams in partnerships between the University of Chicago and NORC, and what great synergies there are there, and how you're pulling from the strengths of both organizations. And actually, this is something I wish the federal statistical agencies could do more, where they have too often we have the silos of here are all the methodologists and statisticians, and the subject matter people are off over there, and we talk to them at the beginning and we talk to them at the end, or once in the middle or something like that. But we do our stuff and it's all nice and pure, and then we hand it to them, and then they can do with what they please with it. And sometimes they don't do the right thing or whatever, but we just can't deal with that.
I've never had that happen. And I'll be curious to hear what some of the other folks have to say, because you're bigger. But with our small team, we actually have a process where we start every project with a designer and a developer. So they're co-leads on a project from the very beginning. And we actually have a process diagram of how we sort of link the parsing and the statistics with the ultimate design, come back. So for example, with China, we were in the middle of designing, and we went back to the team at Reuters and said, if you could get us this data, we could do this. So we're constantly going back and forth. Here's the rub on this for us. There's a gulf, because we have a set of people out there. You have business partners. We have business partners who are used to two different ways of doing it. Either you start with exactly what you just described. We're going to be over here, and then we're going to toss it to you, and you guys make it look good. Or you have people who say, comp it up. Give me a big vision. Show me what it's going to look like. And then they throw it backwards, and they say, fill this all in with data. And you're like, okay. And to be perfectly honest, they're more comfortable with that because they know what they're going to get. So it's that last mile thing where you say, listen, we're going to get our hands dirty with this. We're going to be looking at this. We're going to give you some iterative things, and but it's all going to come together in the last couple of weeks. Don't worry. And they're like, sure. So there's the part, when you do this holistically, it's messy. You go back and forth. You don't, and businesses tend to be organized in steps and stages a little bit differently. So it's constantly a tension, I would say, except with NORC. Never.
I think that's right for us as well. Where
really, you're so cool. No, it won't change.
When we're thinking about doing research, it's usually a bunch of people in a bunch of different roles in the room to hash out what are the really important things that we need to know. What would we possibly do with the data if it turns out this way or that way? And then let's think about either how we need to construct a product experience, be able to collect the data that we need, or whether we need to go external to that. And so we're working with engineers and product managers and designers and even data scientists and analytics at Facebook. Because there might be things that need to be logged or not logged and those sorts of things. And so it really is a real collaborative approach. But I think it's a collaborative approach in that sense because that's how decisions are made at Facebook. But if we're to bring this outside of the tech industry that doesn't have access to all these things, and we think about complementary roles, I am not a data scientist, but I work with data scientists. And what do the data scientists do that I can't do? Well, one, usually they are much better at statistics than I am, and they're much better at programming than I am. And so they help us look at things that we wouldn't necessarily have the skills to look at on our own. Usually that's more behavior log data, but sometimes it is even within survey methods. So, for example, response rates is always an issue, as you mentioned earlier, even back in the 70s. And data scientists were able to help us come up with, help my team come up with some multi-arm bandit studies to optimize how we recruit people on Facebook to take surveys. Could I have ever come up with that on my own? No. Could I have ever come up with the algorithm that resulted from that? in order to mix messages and optimize the response rate that we're getting. No. But what I can do is I can contribute to the starting conversation about what those messages might need to include because of all the work that has been done by people like Dillman, et cetera, on how to invite people to take surveys online. And I can also evaluate whether these different invitations are actually having an impact on the responses that people are giving, because as a survey methodologist, I'm very concerned about that we don't want the invitation to actually impact that. And so we can work together in that, bringing our mutual skills together. And I think that extends beyond tech, where we need to see the value that other groups can bring in to the work that we're already doing, and not think about it as competition, but think about it as triangulating towards a better answer. The more we understand the work that they do, the more we're able to include them in things that are where their skill sets are really superior to ours. So we should definitely understand different groups and definitely include them.
I was trying to think when you asked the question. Going
What
back.
question did I ask? I don't know.
No, I was trying to remember. I don't think, I cannot at the moment think of a single project I've worked on at NORC that was all in one department ever. I mean, I just can't remember that time. But I think we have gotten better at recognizing what every different department can bring to the table from the very beginning. And, having conversations about, at a kickoff meeting with the telephone center, to have a conversation, about the, logistics and the schedule. But for somebody to speak up and say, oh, but, I just read this study that if you phrase the, how you want to get your incentive this way, people, will say yes, but they're a lot less likely to cash their check, and it saves the project money. I mean, things that I never would have read about. But
Ryan is putting his head in his hand right
I've seen those studies.
Thank God he's not at OMB anymore.
And those have huge impacts, and on our studies, and our studies give these departments a chance to be able to experiment with these new methods and new things they saw at APOR or field directors or whatever. So I think that there's always an opportunity for each group to be able to complement each other and help advance each group's research objectives.
This was kind of a funny question. It was meant to be provocative. Is do the Facebooks and Googles scare traditional survey houses or the federal government, and vice versa? And then I was going to say, Curtis, traditional survey houses, scare the Facebooks. But let me
They do, because I hire them as vendors, and sometimes what I see them do is scary.
You were ready for that. Let me actually switch it to the kind of collaboration side of it, since we're on this collaboration theme and different disciplines stuff. Kind of how do we work together? I mean, obviously, Stuart, you have a study where you've worked with Facebook. Kind of what are ways, we've talked a lot today about this leadership position we need to take in the notion of quality and getting the word out and educating our consumers. What's the role that we can all play together, whether it's the federal government, whether it's, partners that we work with on information design, whether it's the kind of collectors, Facebooks, the Googles, whoever, it may be. How do we work together?
It's interesting. I mean, things have evolved, which is an interesting thing. So I think that there's very much a question about process. I was still thinking about the last question, which I didn't get to weigh in too much on. But the thing about teams it's, for me, it is a constant struggle. It is the biggest challenge, because I think it's so central that being able to get the maximum value from the different specialties and perspectives that are members. So, and I try very hard to do it. And I think we work very hard at it, and it works better in some cases than others. And of course, I have enough long experience that I can remember when NORC was very small and it was all in one place. And then it was very easy because you really could figure out who you could talk to most of the people and the specialists right away.
Except for the IT people, because they actually had in the old days at NORC, they had their own kind of private room that was key carded differently than the rest of us. We weren't even allowed to go in there.
Well, my surveys were primitive enough that IT wasn't the major problem. But and that part anyway. But I think that the principle is still the same. The principle is something about well-organized and inclusive meetings where you have the people at the table. But it's also finding the right people, and for me, a lot, the right people is the people who have those kind of bridging capabilities. I mean, it's, I can figure out who the best statistician for the statistical question problem I have, but that's not necessarily the person I want. The person I want is the person who has sufficient statistical skills, but is also going to be interested in understanding my problem. And we're going to be able to have a productive conversation about that. And I think that generalizes. I do think this relates to sort of this issue about as the world is changing, as there are new data sources, as there are, the Googles and the Twitters and the Facebooks that are, in parallel with us and in competition in various ways. I mean, I think it's a little bit like working with government agencies. I mean, it's a process of conversation, and we have responsibilities to educate each other. I mean, I don't know. I don't see. I'm sometimes afraid of entering into these things because I know something, or I can see that there could be conflict. But I'm looking for sort of the overlaps and points of where we do have overlap. And, I think that this is a good example where there's a lot of stuff in common. I mean, I think that, meeting Curtis was, from the beginning, was like, oh, Facebook has to do, he's the guy there, and they need him very badly to do very old-fashioned traditional surveys. And vice versa, that, they need, and that we have tremendous interest and need for being able to understand and access these new forms of data. So it's a basis of a conversation, and I think it's going to take time. So that's one way it's going to work.
I certainly know there's a lot of federal agencies who are very interested in getting access to all kinds of private sector sources of information, and evaluating those and figuring out how they can use those. They're very afraid that their budgets will continue going down, and that they need to be more responsive, figure out how they can use these data sets. They also really are looking for expertise in dealing with big data. However, nobody's dared to define that today, and I'm not going to either. But getting the skill sets, training their people, and helping them figure out how to deal with this high velocity, high volume things that have potentially high payoff, but it also has huge risk for them, because what happens if we have a handshake and a written agreement with Facebook or Google or whoever? This month we produce statistical series. We want to be able to measure change over time. What do you mean next year you disbanded this group because it's not profitable? So there's huge risks for them involved in these kinds of things. But partnerships and those kinds of conversations are things that they're very much, in some agencies more than others, but actively trying to have. Some places they want to just go buy the data, other places,
Those conversations are very hard for us at Facebook. We do want to provide people access to data to do good things with them. So there are plenty of things that the federal government could do with our data that's really good. And academia and research agencies, not to mention just what you're doing, that I think Facebook would be very, very open to those, and we are open to those conversations. We have groups that and that are supposed to be having some of those conversations, but we're also extremely hesitant as a company to open that door. Mm-hmm. And there are a variety of reasons why we're hesitant. And to be absolutely clear, I do not speak for Facebook's official policy on this, but if you think about something that we recently released publicly, where we're able to show better population maps of where people are using their cell phones in places like India and stuff, and knowing where issues of connectivity are in India doesn't just benefit Facebook, but it could benefit as far as development a lot. You can imagine the situation where we release something like that in the Middle East, and we actually end up showing where a camp is of refugees who have fled from some part of Syria and because of dangers. And that the wrong audience gets that because we've released it publicly. And something really bad could happen. And Facebook never wants to be responsible for something like that. You also have to realize that we are regulated globally by many different institutions. And so agreeing to even a study such as yours, where that person might have connections outside of the US, means that we not only have to think about the potential privacy regulatory concerns in the US, but also in those other markets, and whether those markets are as willing to let us do those things as other places. It's just really complex. And the truth is that while we want to go down this road of being able to release some of this data, being able to allow access, it's uncharted territories, and we have relationships with the people on our platform. And so we want to do things that they're comfortable with, that the regulatory agencies are comfortable with, and that we don't think can cause any potential harm. And it's just going to take time for us to work that out, how to do that.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm going to actually, that's great, open it up to the audience for questions. I see one right in the front row. They're coming around with a mic, or you can just talk really loudly.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Cameron. I'm a Penn student, a senior, major in communication. I'm about to go into the real world, so I'm a little nervous. So you guys, I would like to talk about like education and data literacy that you guys talked about for a while, especially in relation to storytelling, the need for storytelling between institutions that Teri mentioned. So I'm very interested in journalism. It seems like a very scary industry to go into right now, but I'm wondering, how do journalists fit into this whole equation of collaboration, conversation, wording, phrasing, all of it? They are supposed to be mediators between these kinds of institutions and the general public. And like, especially in light of citizen journalism, hacktivism, where do they fit in? And also, if you have any nuggets of advice, what types of skills and educational experiences do journalists in the modern world really need to flourish and hopefully promote truth and facts?
Well, Jenny, not to put you on the spot, but as the Deputy Director of the NORC, the AP NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, you might be in a good position to answer that question or start us off.
And I will say that when I was in undergrad in political science, all I wanted to do was go into a polling unit at like a major media outlet, and I had multiple people tell me, it might not be the best idea for your career security. And every single one of them told me that you can have just as much impact telling the same sorts of data stories if you go to the organizations that are creating the data in the first place. So that was what initially drew me to NORC. And now through our media partnership with the Associated Press, I mean, we certainly through that direct connection, we're able to involve editors and journalists in the process from the very beginning. And again, this goes back to, you need to tell a good story, and part of telling a good story is making sure that you're answering a question that people need or want answered. So we have journalists involved from the very beginning, and they may not be the editors or the journalists with the most sophisticated understanding of data or understanding of surveys, but they certainly understand the news value, and they certainly understand how your questions your data and your questions can be translated into a story that people want to read about. And then, on the flip side of the process, once we actually, have the data, we have our findings, and we have our results, we're lucky enough to have this media partnership where we can run our findings by the journalists, make sure that we're phrasing them clearly, we're telling the story concisely, and we sort of get that vetting process in real time. But I think for all of social science research, it's about a sort of a skill set of being able to take complicated research and use it to tell a story. And, an adage of the research speaks for itself it's just nonsense. I mean, it doesn't speak for itself to the vast majority of people. And whether you can improve the story you tell through data visualization or the way that you disseminate the information, I think that there are lots of different channels, but it is certainly a skill set, and it's a very marketable skill set to be able to distill complicated information into a story that the average everyday person can not only understand, but figure out why it's important and applicable to them.
And my best advice to you is to get Teri and Jenny's business cards and talk to them more. So we could continue on this conversation a long time, but let's pick up if there's another question. Great question. Thank you.
Yes.
This has been fascinating. Thank you. I have a question for you about democracy in a couple of the domains you've talked about, one training and the other technology. The training first. You all spoke about training in the academy, how to train us as professionals to do our job better. What about the training of the citizenry? Curtis, you talked so eloquently about a sample that doesn't represent a population and basically is crap much of the time because it purports to tell us about somebody, but it's not a real sample. How do we educate the population to know what a sample is, to know what the right framing of the question is and the right phrasing of that framing of that question so that the question is unbiased, so that we know that the statistical analyses of the data are correct or at least competent, that the interpretation of the findings we come out with are in fact appropriate. Training for democracy seems awfully important, and if we don't do it, who does? On the technology side, the survey that is most important, what's our middle name? National Opinion Research. The opinion that matters most is who we're going to elect. And when you think about all that technology and how we elect our representatives, we're still using basically paper and pencil. Well, a little bit better, but not much. But you know how to protect and get, well, one vote from one guy, gal, and how to protect that, well, the person is the one in the sample. Is there not a technology that is out there that we could provide? I know that political is going to be hard, but can't we up the way in which we do the survey that elects our representatives? What is our responsibility? What do you feel the responsibility for democracy in the training of the general population and in surveying for the elections in our country?
Wow, that's not hard.
I was going to say, you thought some of my questions were, are you voting? Glad I'm not a panelist.
Aren't we out of time soon?
So I think there are a couple of things. And one of them is not probably a very popular position, but I don't think it's our responsibility to impose training on the electorate that they don't demand themselves. There are plenty of people out there who are reading survey results from all these different sources, some of high quality, some of low quality. They're paying attention to sentiment analysis and things like that. And I think we as a profession of opinion researchers do need to I think when there is crap out there, we need to call it crap. Very explicitly and very publicly. When people are engaging in unethical or survey practices, or when they're engaging in research practices that we know leads to wrong conclusions, that we need to actually say that publicly, either through various media sources or even just writing responses wherever these things are being posted ourselves. As far as helping the electorate with a better election system, there's a lot of technology out there that can do a lot of things. The people that I think are most scared of a technological solution to voting are computer scientists. At least every time I hear why we should never have machine-based voting, are computer scientists saying how easy it would be to rig the system. So I think that we can identify people. We can limit their responses in various ways to things, to giving them one response. But the incentive to try to cheat the system is much lower when you're talking about engaging in a poll on social media or something like that than it is the election for who is essentially the leader of the free world if we're talking about the U.S. And if I can sound a bit hegemonic there. And so I think the systems already exist that would have enough rigor, but I don't think there's enough trust there, and I don't think you get the trust there without the computer scientists. And so I don't know what the answer is to that.
So I'm going to challenge the group. I actually think the data literacy thing is something that you should think about. I mean, certainly other companies are doing this. Witness ING at the end of the Great Recession, which was, had the We the Savers. It was blatantly advertising, but they had real sort of systems, and they had cafes where they gave financial advice, and they did things. I don't know. I put it to you. Usually working in sort of one mode, but to have a data literacy platform, a way that you talk about this, whether it's op-eds, whether it's a real marketing platform where you actually try to raise the level of dialogue about, you're in dialogue with the culture by virtue of what you do. So is there some kind of way, something to start to think about there? Maybe.
Well, another approach that the American Statistical Association, I'm sure others have taken as well, is statistical literacies, is get kids in school to have more exposure to, and they're growing up in a data world exploding with data. They need to understand a lot more about what's going on and how to use some basic principles of statistics and statistical thinking and critical thinking. And so some of these initiatives that they have done, and I mean, expanding upon things like that, Bob, that's kind of what I was hearing you, or one response to that would be something along those lines. Part of, I think, another, to build off of Curtis's thing, unfortunately, we often don't know when it's crap, or we don't have the evidence that it's crap. Well, we know it's crap, but that is, by the way, a technical statistical. So some of the transparency initiatives people aren't putting out that yeah, I did this survey in 5 seconds and I made up all the data, or it came from this, or I have this awful sample, but believe my results anyway. They're not publishing, they're not documenting or providing any of that background information, and so pushing more for, like APOR has, for transparency initiatives, and you talked about censuring, which they have done in the past to folks as well, to make sure that the more information is coming out and is being reported by journalists, hopefully, about what is behind the numbers, not just simply the 2 seconds, the 2-sentence line.
It's funny. I'm struggling with this a little bit because I sort of presume that it is something that is so deeply ingrained. But I think it's a very tricky, it's a difficult thing. I was hearing that being raised over and over again. How do we educate? the public, but it just feels like, my training as a scientist and my training and every report I've ever written, I mean, the reflexes of explaining method, of transparency, I mean, all the sort of norms of research and science feel like, but I guess I don't know there's two things here that are interesting to me. One is I also feel a commitment to communicating the findings and the importance and the conclusions, and in a way that people can understand. So I do think that is a struggle, how you balance those. I mean, you could put out a whole pile of mumbo jumbo and statistical jargon that is not going to achieve that goal. So I think I'm always struggling with balancing those things. The other thing is, I think we have to have vigorous debate. I mean, I think some of these questions that we're raising are really there are assumptions that we have made about what is the litmus test and that we have fetishized, like response rates, right? Or I've struggled with this myself. I mean, the commitment to probabilistic sampling seems so central to the enterprise. And to me, it still defines the goal and the purpose. But I have been forced, along with everybody else, to realize that we have to also look at alternatives. And they can operate as adjuncts or even pure alternatives. So I'm fascinated. And, I think the Google flu thing was a perfect example. So and of course, one of our problems is the public doesn't necessarily follow the whole story. But, that's a perfect learning example where they thought and they told us there was a solution and it worked. And then we have now realized that it only worked in that short window and that it was wrong. And so we're learning something along the way. I'm actually quite fascinated, and I think we're going to see more and more of this. It is now entering into the general discourse debates about science and scientific evidence and the quality of scientific evidence. And there was the recent stuff in the New York Times about the gay canvassing, the guy who got his article booted out of Science. I don't know if I can really go into the details. But the interesting point here is that it's actually a story that has now reached the general media that's actually in its second or third chapter. So we have to become quite sophisticated that it's not like, you would sort of raise the issue, there's certain factoids that get out there and they can be quite dangerous, like vaccination and autism and things like that. Obviously they have to be debated and we have to corrected. That doesn't necessarily work immediately, but we also have to understand that there are questions that we thought we had answers to, that there's new evidence and that get reopened, and sometimes they're wrongly answered, but then that doesn't mean it's over. And to me, that's the whole joy of this discipline and the process.
So no doubt that Bob Michael asked one question that we could have discussed for an hour and a half. I struggled with 100 questions, and Bob asked the one that we could continue on. So thank you, Bob. But really, thank you to the panelists. You guys were absolutely incredible. So thank you. I think the diversity of backgrounds and the diversity of ideas, and I think what I'm most excited about is continuing the conversation and our continued collaboration. So thank you.
So you guys can just stay put for 1 sec. So this is just going to be very brief closing, and I'm going to finish where I started with some thank yous. Although I will just say in response to Bob's question and to what some of the panelists said, NORC absolutely needs to be a center of truth in an uncertain world. And that means that we absolutely need to be explaining to people why these data are relevant, how you distinguish between data that might get you in, data and analysis that might get you into trouble versus data and analysis that are going to be useful for your most important decisions. That's our mission, that's our purpose, and that's what we're going to keep doing. I think you guys covered that really, really well. The thank yous are to all of you for, This was a incredibly rich and wonderful, but admittedly long day, as is true to form for NORC, I must say. So I am grateful to all of you for coming. I'm grateful for all of you who have stayed with us through this wonderful event. I want to thank all of our presenters. We'll have a round of applause for everybody at the end. But there are a few people who I just want to stand up. First of all, Bob Michael. Stand up. No, pause at the end. Stand up. We're going to clap at the end. Michael Reynolds. Is he still here? Okay. No. Linda Waite. And Mike Davern. Is Mike Davern still here? Mike may have had to go. This is our committee. Is Mike here? Yeah, Dan. Oh, and Dan Black. I'm sorry, Dan. So this is our committee who planned this event. Great job. Thank you guys so much. And to our moderators, Missy and Felicia. Is Felicia still around? She may have had to go. She's working on a grant. And who am I leaving out? And Kate. So thank you guys so much. This is really, I think, a clear demonstration of how the collaborations between the university and NORC are alive and well, thriving. The history is rich. The history continues. And we'll look forward to doing another one of these at 150 years. But again, 100 years. But thank you all so much. Really wonderful conversation and lots to think about and lots of good work to do. So again.